Hi, my name is Carla McGregor. I'm recording this lecture so that your professors can use it in the course materials that they are scrambling to put online in the midst of the pandemic. A little bit of background. I'm currently at Boys Town National Research Hospital, and normally I would have the professionalism and the excellence of our media team behind me when I would do a project like this. But they're also scrambling to take care of urgent matters at Boys Town. So give some grace there. And then I also want to say that technically I have co-authors because I'm going to be lecturing from a paper that was just published with my co-authors who are Lisa Goffman, Amanda Van Horn, Tiffany Hogan, and Liza Feinstack. And they're busy taking care of issues in their personal and professional lives as well. So I'm just solo, and that's all just to say that if I say something idiotic during the lecture, that's me. It's no one else's fault. I'm just here doing my best. So the talk that I'm going to give today refers back to the catalyzed documents that were developed by Bishop and her colleagues and published in 2016 and 17. I've tried to prepare the lectures so that you don't really have to have read those documents in order to understand the lecture, but they are referenced at the end of this PowerPoint and they're all open access, easy to find. I strongly encourage you to read them. They're excellent, and I'd rather for them to speak for themselves than for me to speak about their work. What I am going to be talking about today is a paper that my co-authors and I have just published in a 2020 issue of Perspectives. It's a special forum called the Specific Language Impairment Developmental Language Disorders Forum. There are other papers in that forum. You can see them listed here. I won't be talking about those today. The papers that I will be talking about are the one that my co-authors and I published, and then of course referring back to the catalyzed documents. The paper that we published is essentially a tutorial or a perspective on the catalyzed findings and recommendations. The catalyzed work was essentially a gathering of experts from, I believe it was 6 different English-speaking countries who were interested in and passionate about summarizing the state of the art and our understanding of what was then usually referred to as specific language impairment, although I think one of the primary reasons for their gathering and discussion is that this condition had gone by so many different names it was quite confusing. And I think they also took an important step in evaluating our evidence base and coming to some conclusions about what we really know about this condition and where we need to go to learn more. A fairly standard definition of specific language impairment, this one published by Larry Leonard in 2004, children who show a significant deficit in their spoken language ability with no obvious accompanying problems. This type of language disorder is regarded as developmental in nature because affected children exhibit language learning problems from the outset. So a significant problem with spoken language, we see it early on in development, there's no obvious accompanying problem. So that definition has served us well for a very long time, but there are some problematic aspects about the definition or about how it's been applied in the research literature. So the typical approach in the research literature has been to identify children who have specific language impairment by their low scores on standardized tests. But there's absolutely no consensus on how low it needs to be before you decide someone has this problem. In clinical applications, the same problem exists. You will find from center to center or school district to school district many different guidelines in where you would cut that distribution in order to say on this side you have typical language development, on this side we think you have a language impairment. So that's a problem. A second typical application is to although you acknowledge that functional impairments exist, we rarely would take the time or the steps in the research lab to identify those functional impacts. So we're meaning things like what is the impact on their academics, on their social life, on their emotional health, on their ability to take care of themselves in daily life, etc. So there certainly is a research literature documenting functional impacts, but we've rarely taken the time to document them as an inclusionary criteria for putting these children in our studies. That's a problem. For one, it misaligns with public school identifications in the United States, and I think in other countries as well, where an important aspect of identification is documenting that there really is a functional impact. In the public schools, not surprisingly, the main focus is on whether there's an academic impact. Also, traditionally in the research literature, we've excluded children from the SLI category if their nonverbal IQ is low. Now, I want to be clear that we're not talking about, I think there's two things here. There's separating people who have perhaps specific language impairment from those who have intellectual disability. So that might be a 70 or below kind of IQ, although functional impact also is taken into regard in making that decision. But we're talking about sort of low average nonverbal IQs here. Like, do you call someone specific, do you say someone has a specific language impairment if their nonverbal IQ is 80? How about 75? So neither of those indicates an intellectual disability, but some people won't include these children if they have a low average IQ. The problem is how low is not anything that anyone has agreed upon. So there is a range over a full standard deviation from 70 to 90 as a cutoff, below which you cannot be in an SLI group in our research literature. That from Gallinet and Spalding, 2014, I believe. All right, and then the other thing that was typical in the research literature is to rule out accompanying problems. So you don't have SLI if you also have ADHD, for example. But which problems do we rule out, and which are, no one would say you can't have SLI and arthritis, right? So which problems began to be something that you would use an exclusionary criteria, and why would we do them? And also, how do we identify them? So what we would typically do in the research literature is, and I did this, so I'm not criticizing anyone else. This is what we all have done, more or less. So we would do a pure tone audiometric screening, and the child failed. We would say, okay, might have a hearing loss, won't put them in the SLI group. We would do some kind of intake or parent report to rule out things like autism, but we would rarely measure for any of those problems. So that's a limitation in what we've been doing. There are also some problems with the term specific language impairment itself, and this was a matter of great debate and discussion in the Catalyze meetings. So first and foremost, specific isn't really an accurate descriptor. So the deficit is not really specific to language. We've got decades of research showing that these children also have some motor issues, some social emotional issues, some attention executive function issues. And so to say the problem is specific to language, that's not really true, at least for the population as a whole. Another difficulty is the term SLI has not been universally accepted. So Dorothy Bishop in 2014 surveyed the literature and the labels used therein, and she found 132 different terms for this particular condition. Some of them were quite vague, like communication disorder, so that's not really inaccurate, but it's vague. And then we have all kinds of variations on the theme, like primary language impairment, specific language disorder, developmental language disability, etc., etc. So the list goes on and on. You can imagine how confusing that is for everyone who's trying to read the literature, let alone the general public. So this particular Venn diagram summarizes the Phase 2 Catalyzed project on terminology. This is the consensus they came up with. So instead of specific language impairment, they recommend the term developmental language disorder, or instead of 130 other options, they recommend developmental language disorder. And that is meant to describe children who have problems with any or all of the domains of language: syntax, morphology, semantics, word finding, pragmatics, discourse, verbal learning and memory, and phonology. So these are the same problems that we would have called SLI in the past. So that's not really different. All right. Well, we also know that some children who have other conditions like autism or Down syndrome or hearing loss, for example, also have problems in these domains. For those conditions, we would use the term language disorder associated with blank. So language disorder associated with congenital hearing loss would be an example. We also know that some children have problems with the speech sound system, but it's more of a structural or motoric deficit than a linguistic deficit, something we would call phonology. So these children, we would say, we wouldn't put them in the developmental language disorder group. They might better, more accurately be called, say, a problem with childhood apraxia of speech or an articulation disorder. Personally, I do think those differences can be hard to tease apart, but nevertheless. And then finally, we can think about the more superordinate category that DLD would fit into, and that would include things like voice disorders, fluency disorders, etc., and other communication needs that aren't disorders even, like just, I'm trying to learn a second language here, give me a break. So in the United States, the superordinate category would probably not be called speech, language, and communication needs. That's a fairly specific to the UK term. I believe it describes how children in their school systems qualify for services. In the United States, if the child is in school and 0 to 8, the superordinate category would probably be general delay. Otherwise, the category would probably be speech or language impairment, unfortunately also abbreviated as SLI, but speech or language impairment. Perhaps specific learning disability, depending on the nature of the developmental language disorder itself. So in all situations, we would expect some larger groupings or superordinate categories, and DLD will certainly fit into those categories, although they might go in different titles or labels depending on where you are in the world. All right, so let's see how this plays out, these recommendations in the Catalyzed 2 documents. So imagine that a child presents to your clinic with a difficulty producing or understanding language, and that this affects everyday functioning. So we've got the low score and its impact already there. The next thing to ask is, are they unfamiliar with the local language? In other words, are they English language learners or whatever language context you're in, second language learners? And if they are, but competent in another language, then we're not talking about DLD here, right? We're just talking about a child who needs more exposure and more time to gain an additional language. Okay, but what if they aren't? What if this is their native language that's a problem? Then we say, do they have features suggestive of a poor prognosis? If no, then we probably aren't dealing with a developmental language disorder, okay? These are not temporary problems. These are not delays. These are persistent problems. So if there are signs that there's a poor prognosis, what would those signs be? It would be things like problems that are quite severe, or problems that have already been pretty long-standing, like this child is 4, 5, 6 years old already. If that's the case, then we've got a language disorder. Okay, but then we need to see if we need to bifurcate. Is there associated medical diagnosis like hearing loss or autism? If so, then it's a language disorder associated with autism, etc. If not, then we've likely got a developmental language disorder. That doesn't mean you want to ignore the rest of their profile, and that's why you see the additional information block on co-occurring disorders, risk factors, and what specific areas of language are problematic for that particular child. Okay, so what we've done so far is define DLD and give you an example of how you would work through clinical decision making to arrive at that diagnosis to determine whether that particular diagnostic label is appropriate. Now, I don't want you to walk away from this lecture thinking that that's the only term that you'll ever need to use. In the research literature, you're seeing that term more and more and more and more, thanks to the impact of the Catalyze working groups. Debate does continue, especially in the United States, over continued use of SLI. Should we use both or the other one, or how do we do that? And I won't weigh in on that except to say that certainly because SLI has been a predominant term for so many years, we really must use both terms, if not 132 terms, in our literature searches in order to access the complete body of research that already exists when we're trying to conduct research. In U.S. public schools, we'll also see the terms developmental delay, speech or language impairment, and specific learning disability that might apply to a child who has DLD. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, so this is more medical settings, you'll often see these used, this nosology used. We'll see the term neurodevelopmental disorder, which is a very broad term, includes things like ADHD, Tourette's, fluency problems, autism, etc. Subgroup communication disorder, subgroup language disorder, or perhaps specific learning disorder, depending on the exact manifestations of this child's problem. And then finally, for billing insurance in the United States, we need other terms yet. The billing codes that would be most applicable to a child who has DLD would be expressive language disorder or expressive and receptive language disorder. Okay, so those slides really summarize the Catalyze 2 focus on terminology, but the Catalyze 1 discussions had more to do with an evidence-based description of what this category is all about and how we come to clinical decision makings. And I think this is a very, very useful document for that reason. So I want to take you through this summary from the Catalyze 1 consensus. So what if a child presented with a concern about speech, language, or communication? Well, yeah, we're going to be concerned there. What about a behavioral or psychiatric difficulty? You might not automatically think to assess language there, but they're so often comorbid and often more salient and noticeable to a parent that sometimes the language disorder piece can be missed. So that would be a good reason to refer for an evaluation of language. What about extreme departures from typical development in an under 5? Well, that would be your sign, maybe poor prognosis, so this we need to care about, or persistent problems with comprehension 5 and above. Again, that signals a poor prognosis, and so we really want to evaluate. Now, if the child, though, is very, very young, so a toddler, a late talker, we might say, there's more clinical uncertainty about whether we want to refer for an evaluation or whether we want to do an active watch and wait, monitor kind of situation. All right, so any of these cases we've referred for evaluation. Now we're going to get an assessment of speech, language, and communication. What's that going to look like? Well, for one, we're going to combine information from the caregiver, from observing, from giving standardized tests, and from a language learning context. Right? So we don't want just the standardized test. We want to start getting at the functional impact. We would approach the problem knowing that language ability is continuous. There's no sharp cutoff between normal or typical and impaired. Yet again, a reason to weigh functional impact into the decision making. We would use a staged approach. So the initial assessment is going to look at both expressive and receptive skills, but we can narrow down to one of those or both of those or specific domains as needed as we go further. We know that different aspects of language vary in sensitivity to social and language background. So, for example, vocabulary we think of as having a very strong environmental influence. It's hard to learn some words if you haven't heard lots of words, right? Grammar maybe a bit of more of a genetic and less of a environmental, but we really don't know enough to know that combination of social versus biological contributions. It's a very complicated mix, even in typical development, and probably a mix that the weights of which fluctuate over development. So we're not going to try to make that clinical decision. Really what this could boil down to is a greater consideration of children from backgrounds of poverty, not dismissing them as potentially not having a language disorder because of their impoverished backgrounds. Measures of language learning can complement static tests of knowledge and skills. That's evidence for the validity and usefulness of dynamic assessments, for example. We know that pragmatics and social communication should also be assessed alongside other domains of language like morphosyntax and the lexicon. And we also know that an assessment by a speech-language pathologist can help to determine if the problem with speech is linguistic, so that would be the more phonological, yes, this is part of DLD, versus structural and motoric, that would be more of an apraxia in origin. Although I will say, I think that's still a pretty sticky thing to distinguish. All right, and then finally, we would identify additional factors. Does the problem co-occur with problems with motor, attention, etc.? Because these kinds of weaknesses in other areas are so common, it's not specific to language. The language impairment should be recognized regardless of level of nonverbal ability, unless that's so low as to constitute an intellectual disability. And language impairments associated with known conditions would need specialist assessment, a team approach for sure, to fully diagnose something like language disorder associated with Down syndrome, for example. Okay, so what I hope I've done thus far is to summarize Catalyze 1 and 2, what we learned from those consensus groups. By the way, I wasn't part of any of those consensus groups, so I'm not speaking as a person who contributed to that decision making, but as a person who's been influenced by the conclusions that they reached. All right, so what I want to do now is talk through some of the advantages of those consensus recommendations, the recommendation to use the term DLD, and in my mind, more importantly, the consensus that they came to on its application. All right, so first of all, it certainly would be the case that if we had a universal or even nearly universal term, we'd be better off in terms of advocating for people who have DLD. 132 different terms for the same thing is extremely confusing, and it really is a barrier to awareness of the condition and understanding what it is. Literally, two families, each living with DLD, could be talking to each other and not even realize that their children have the same problem, because there were so many different terms out there. It's really quite confusing, and it is a true barrier. How does that barrier matter? Oh my goodness, it matters, right? So if people don't understand what this is or have never heard of it, then we're going to have policymakers who don't care. Well, I mean, you can't care about something you've never heard of, right? And we're also going to have lack of concern on the part of the people who are in the best position to advocate for children who have DLD, parents, pediatricians, and teachers. If you don't know that your child has a language problem or why that matters, then you are not going to be the one in there pushing for services, talking to your speech language pathologist at your school, asking for special assessments to make sure the child's on track. If you're a policymaker, you're not going to be funding a lot of research. If you have, why would you push for funds for a problem that you don't even really know exists? And of course, when we get to this level of a lack of clinical services and educational supports and a lack of research on the problem, those feed each other back and forth, back and forth. I can say with certainty, so most of the research I've ever done is on DLD, but I also have done some research on children who have autism and children who have hearing loss. Autism is about 8 times less frequent. I could say it the other way around. DLD is 8 times more frequent than autism. DLD is 50 times more frequent than childhood hearing loss, congenital hearing loss. But it is easier to get participants with hearing loss and ASD into the lab than children with DLD. Because so many of them go unidentified, they lack clinical services, they don't even know to self-identify as having DLD. And of course, it works the other way. If we're not doing research on the condition, we're not finding new evidence about how best to identify and treat it in our clinical and educational realms. I want to add another block of reciprocal consequences. This is for a U.S. context, and in countries where there is universal health care, this is less likely to be an issue, but certainly in the United States, a lack of concern on the part of parents, pediatricians, and teachers, and a lack of concern on the part of policymakers makes for a lack of insurance coverage, which is then going to even further reduce the likelihood that children are going to get the services that they need. Okay, so pardon the wardrobe change. I didn't like how I explained this slide, so I'm dubbing over it for you on a different day. Okay, so what I want to say about this is that although I'm hypothesizing that the lack of awareness is driving lack of clinical services and research, the actual lack of clinical services and research for these children and for the condition that they are living with is not hypothetical at all. So I'm going to show you 2 examples of each of these problems. In 2010, Dorothy Bishop published a paper called Which Neurodevelopmental Disorders Get Researched and Why? And what she did is she reviewed the literature and looked at the numbers of papers that were published on numerous different neurodevelopmental disorders, DLD included. And she found that DLD was really at the bottom of the pack. So in a period of from 1985 to 2009, she found that there was 0.13 papers for every 100 people in the UK affected by DLD. So a fraction of a paper on DLD for every 100 likely cases of DLD in the United Kingdom. I've recently written a paper that's under review where I replicated Dr. Bishop's procedures, but I updated with the most current decade to see if we've made any progress. So in other words, I looked at the time from 2010 to 2019. What I found was that there was 0.03 papers on DLD for every 100 cases of DLD in the US,
If we translate that to the UK, which of course has a smaller population, it goes up a little. It's still horribly low, 0.16 papers per 100 cases. And to put that into perspective, there were 7.94 papers for every 100 cases of autism in the US. The only condition that's receiving less support in the research literature than DLD of all of the neurodevelopmental conditions reviewed, which was, I believe, 31, the only condition that receives less attention is speech sound disorders. On the clinical side, in 1997, Bruce Tomlin conducted a community screening because he was trying to identify children who had, at that time, what we would call SLI, in a large cohort of kindergarteners. And he found these children, hundreds of them, and he was pretty surprised to realize that only 39% of children who were scoring below the 3rd percentile, that's a very, very low score, only 39% of those children had ever been identified as having any language problems. So the vast majority of them were going unnoticed, unidentified. Again, we'd hope we would make progress, but in 2016, Courtney Norbury repeated a very similar process that Bruce Tomlin had used in the UK. And she found that only 3.5% of the children who met her criteria for DLD, and these criteria included functional impact, by the way, only 3.5% of them received services at school. 39% of them received some services outside of school, apparently via private practice options.
All right, so then one of the advantages of the term DLD is it might, if we would coalesce around it, we might be in a better position to advocate for these children. I want to go on to some other advantages, and these perhaps have less to do with the term and more to do with the way it's conceptualized and its application plays out according to the Catalyze recommendations. So one of those conclusions in Catalyze is that DLD frequently occurs with other neurodevelopmental difficulties. We've already made that case, like ADHD or developmental coordination disorder would be another common comorbidity. The boundaries between DLD and other neurodevelopmental disorders can be quite fuzzy. In other words, which one is primary? Does he have both? You know, this gets to be very difficult. Well, this sort of conclusion is consistent with research findings, a long history of research findings, that the condition is not specific to language. As a population, these individuals have documented weaknesses in non-linguistic auditory processing and symbolic play, social and emotional function, executive function, motor control, among others. Another advantage of this Catalyze conceptualization is that I think that artificial exclusions of people with associated conditions, the way we used to do when we applied the definition of SLI, could actually be hampering our research progress. So let's think about the search for a phenotype. What is the DLD phenotype? Well, maybe if we get so many common comorbidities with, say, ADHD, then maybe attention problems are part of the broader phenotype. Or if we get so many comorbidities, these subtle weaknesses in motor control, maybe motor involvement is actually part of the phenotype. And when we artificially exclude people who have those difficulties, we're never going to get the accurate picture of what the phenotype really is, at least at the population level. Similarly, we could be shooting ourselves in the foot and finding the cause of the problem. So what if the frequent co-occurrence between, say, ADHD and DLD is because they share a common cause, or one poses a risk for the other? If we exclude those children with ADHD from our samples, it's going to be very hard to realize that their commonalities might indicate some common risks or a cause. And finally, I think that situating DLD alongside other neurodevelopmental disorders, as recommended in Catalyze, does hold some advantages for at least highlighting, I think, what we already know in the research world, but highlighting views of DLD as dimensional, complex, varying over developmental time. It also helps us to understand that that children can grow in and out of diagnoses. This happens all the time in neurodevelopmental disorders, where something that looked like perhaps some general developmental delay, a little older, we come to give a more specific diagnosis like DLD. Maybe a little older, that child also acquires a diagnosis of a reading disability. And it doesn't mean that the general delay, the DLD, or the reading disability, it doesn't mean any of those is wrong. That's how the neurodevelopmental disorders morph and change over the course of development. And I think situating DLD in the neurodevelopmental disorders framework helps us to realize that it puts those kinds of complex situations into perspective. All right, another advantage that we discussed in the paper is that this conclusion that low nonverbal ability does not preclude a diagnosis of DLD. Again, just to be clear, unless it's so low as to mean that the child would be more accurately classified as having an intellectual disability. But certainly 75 IQ DLD, 85 IQ DLD, 105 IQ DLD, if other characteristics of weakness in language and functional impact exist. I think what's good about that for the research world is that it's actually quite consistent with our research findings that we've been collecting for decades. So there isn't any clear evidence that SLI is a separate category or subgroup. Now, it's a subgroup in the sense that the old definition would lead you to form a smaller group because you'd be excluding more kids. The DLD definition leads you to form a broader group. It's a subgroup in that sense, but there isn't any good evidence that suggests there's something really different, categorically different about a child with SLI from a child with DLD who happens to have a low average IQ. I think the best recent example of that kind of evidence is in Lancaster and Camerata, 2019, where they discussed DLD as a spectrum disorder, and I do recommend that paper to you. It's also the case that if we artificially exclude people with low average nonverbal IQs, we could hinder our research progress. We're going to limit our ability to understand associations between the development of verbal and nonverbal cognition, for example. And I think those associations could be especially meaningful when it comes to DLD. So even in studies that are more traditionally SLI defined, the SLI group tends to have a lower statistically lower nonverbal IQ than the typical comparison group in that paper. In a large meta-analysis, Gallinet and Spalding found that difference to be more than half a standard deviation. So I think that tells us something, right? And if we exclude those children who have lower nonverbal IQs from DLD, I think we're missing something meaningful about the phenotype in that particular case. Okay, and then finally, we're going to turn to some advantages of the term DLD and its application in terms of clinical practices. And this is fairly US-centric, but in the United States, US law specifies that children receive special education services in US public schools if their disability, and there are, I think, 13 categories of disability recognized under US law, if those disabilities result in a functional impact on their academics, right? So it really doesn't matter what the standardized test score is. If you cannot demonstrate an impact on that child's learning at school, then you're not going to get those services. So this emphasis on functional impact as part of the definition of the problem is highly consistent with clinical practices, at least in the States. I think that the sort of anti-cognitive referencing stance in the catalyzed documents is also quite consistent with clinical practices and with best evidence, best practice. We know that children who have higher or lower, but still not intellectually disabled, nonverbal IQs, they both benefit from being identified in the sense that they both benefit from getting services. They can both make progress. In Norbury and colleagues' recent paper, they were able to compare children with sort of low average nonverbal IQ and average or above, all of whom had DLD, and they didn't find any differences between those two groups in severity of the language impairment, in speech production abilities, in their social emotional development, in their educational achievement, or in referral rates for speech, language, and educational services. So there just isn't great evidence for suggesting that we should be somehow working out who gets services or what kinds of services they should get on the basis of their nonverbal IQ. And in that sense, I think the catalyzed recommendations are highly evidence-based and consistent with good practice. Okay, we're coming towards the end now. I'm about 40 minutes in, and I'm aiming to fit into a 50-minute class period because I think that's fairly typical in most university settings. So we're getting there. I'm going to conclude the lecture in the same way that we concluded the paper. I'll just read this quote. The characterization of DLD, as presented in Catalyze, motivates a fresh approach to understanding neurodevelopmental language deficit, one that recognizes its dimensional nature, so not categorical, anticipates variations over developmental time. It's going to present as something different when you're 5, when you're 8, when you're 15, when you're 20, and values what can be gained by examining a broader phenotype, not just language and attention, language and social involvement, behavioral problems, etc. It provides a useful platform for advocates, motivates new directions for research, and reflects clinical practice in the United States. So my co-authors and I really felt like this statement summarized our enthusiasm for the catalyzed recommendations. You know, the special form and perspectives was meant to be on the terminology. Should we use SLI or DLD or both? Personally, and this is just me, I won't speak for my colleagues at this point, I don't really care what the term is. There certainly is a problem in having 132 of them. And so I think to the extent that we get on the same page and be consistent will really help people with DLD because we can promote better awareness and understanding of the condition. But the term itself, to me, that's not what's very interesting. I think what's more interesting and meaty in the catalyzed documents is this evidence-based summary of the state of the art in what this problem really is and what we know about how to identify it. So again, I'll encourage you to actually read the catalyzed documents. I also have some suggestions for you. I'm going to take you to the next slide.
If you'd like to get involved in advocacy and awareness efforts, helping people more in the lay public understand DLD, I'll direct you to 2 resources. The first is rattle.org, stands for Raising Awareness of DLD. It's an international group, all volunteers working to post resources, information, videos, and stories about DLD. Thanks to ambassadors worldwide, we have materials translated into over 20 languages, and we'll continue trying to make more and more of those materials available. I really encourage you to take a look at the videos and stories. These have been shared by people who actually have DLD or their families, and they're very powerful. The other resource I recommend is dldandme.org. At dldandme.org, we're trying to assemble and continually update parent-friendly articles that are evidence-based. Each article covers a single topic that's relevant to DLD, and we'll continue to update them. We aim to post one new article per month, and we usually get there. Again, it's a group of volunteers, so we're doing the best we can. All of the papers I've mentioned in this lecture are listed here. I hope you'll find the list useful in finding new resources that will further your knowledge of DLD. If you want any more information from me or information about my work, you can follow me on Twitter at McGregor Carla. You can visit my website at Boys Town, or you can search for me in OSF. Thank you so much for listening to this lecture. Please be safe out there.